Emily Parker didn't know that day would change her life forever. For almost 2 years, she had been working as a nurse at Westbridge Private Hospital, one of the most renowned in the city. The routine was intense, but she loved what she did. Her goal had always been simple: to care for patients with humanity, even when they couldn't talk back. But that morning, when she was called into the office of Dr. Matthews, the head of neurology, her stomach tightened. His serious voice on the phone left. No room for interpretation. Something was about to happen, and she didn't know if it was good or bad. As she walked down the immaculately white hallway, her heart pounded. Had she done something wrong? Was this a warning, a transfer, or even a termination? The gleaming mahogany door to Dr. Matthews' office seemed even more imposing now. Taking a deep breath, she knocked and entered when she heard the signal. The room smelled of antiseptic, mixed with expensive leather. Dr. Matthews was standing near the window, looking out over the city. It wasn't often that she saw him like this. When he finally turned around, his gaze was steady but enigmatic. "Emily, we have a patient who needs special care," he said slowly. "But this job isn't for everyone." Her heart raced. Special patient. It wasn't like him to sound like that. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The doctor gestured to a thick chart on his desk. "Ethan Coleman," he said, and the name rang through Emily's chest like a shock. Ethan Coleman, the billionaire, the business magnate, the man whose name had dominated headlines until a year ago, when he suffered a devastating accident that left him in a coma. His company, Coleman Industries, was still in business, but without its leader, everything seemed uncertain. Emily shivered when she saw the newspaper clipping pinned to the chart. A picture of the luxury car smashed to pieces after it had plunged off a bridge in the middle of the night. Since then he had been motionless, breathing only with the help of machines. Dr. Matthews continued, "Most nurses do the bare minimum. He gets the medical care he needs, but no one really cares. His family rarely visits him. We need someone who will go the extra mile, who will treat Ethan Coleman not like a lost cause, but like a human being." Emily swallowed. It wasn't just the weight of the name that made this case challenging. It was the thought of caring for someone who might never wake up again, of giving her time to be a silent presence, not knowing if her words, her touch, her dedication would make a difference. But something inside her knew the answer before the words were even out of her mouth. "I do." Emily's shift began that night. The VIP wing of the hospital was on the top floor, isolated from the rest of the patients, and Ethan Coleman's room looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital bed. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Dark wood furniture gave the room a sophisticated feel, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of the city. In the center of it all, the hospital bed contrasted with the sophistication of the room. There, motionless, surrounded by tubes and monitors, was Ethan. Even unconscious, his presence was impressive. His sharp jaw, slightly disheveled hair, and strong features made him look as if he could simply open his eyes at any moment and go back to his old life. But Emily knew better. She approached him cautiously, sensing a strange tension in the air. She adjusted the IV, checked the monitors, and finally prepared a warm cloth to clean his skin. She hesitated before touching him. This wasn't her first time caring for a comatose patient, but there was something different about this, as if Ethan could somehow sense her presence. A shiver ran down her spine, but she pushed it aside and began the procedure gently. She ran the damp cloth down his arm, then down his chest. The warmth of the contact made his skin tingle slightly. "You don't have a choice, do you?" she murmured, almost playfully, as she finished cleaning his face. As expected, no answer came. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor. "I'll take that as a no." She smiled slightly, but her expression soon became serious again. It wasn't fair. The man who once dominated meeting rooms and decided the course of a billion-dollar company was now nothing more than an inert, a body in a hospital bed. How many people around him still saw him as the person he once was? Days turned into weeks, and soon it became a habit. Emily talked to Ethan every day, even though she didn't get any answers. She told him about the hospital, about the drama between the doctors, and even about her personal life. "If you were awake, I think you'd hate the food here. I've had better food on airplanes." A small routine developed, and strangely enough, she began to feel connected to the sleeping man. It was absurd, but sometimes she felt like he was listening. And then one night, as she adjusted his pillow, she felt something. A subtle movement, a gentle pressure against her wrist. Her heart raced. Ethan Coleman had moved. The air seemed to freeze around Emily. Her gaze darted to Ethan's hand, searching for any further sign of movement. But nothing. His fingers were still against the white sheet again. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Had she imagined it? Was it just an involuntary spasm? Trying to remain calm, she swallowed hard and touched his hand gently, waiting for a reaction. Silence. Nothing but the steady beep of the heart monitor. "I'm seeing things," she murmured to herself, taking a small step back. But deep down, the doubt remained. What if it wasn't just a reflex? The next morning, she decided to report what had happened to Dr. Matthews. He listened attentively, without showing any emotion, and then let out a weary sigh. "Involuntary movements are common in patients with this condition, Emily. Don't get your hopes up." But she couldn't ignore what she felt. Something inside her told her this was different, and her intuition was confirmed a few days later. As she was doing her daily routine, she felt a light touch against her skin once again. This time there was no doubt. Ethan's fingers had moved. Determined, Emily began to observe every little detail more closely, and the more time passed, the more signs appeared. A muscle that twitched slightly, the eyes moving under the lids, a sigh deeper than normal, until, in a moment of impulse, she held his hand firmly and whispered, "If you can hear me, if you're in there, give me a sign." The silence stretched on, almost to the point of making her feel foolish, but then she felt it, weak, hesitant, but real. A squeeze. The shock made her breath catch in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes wide. She wasn't imagining it. He was there, trapped in that sleeping body, trying to communicate. Without thinking twice, Emily ran to the intercom and called the doctors. Within minutes, the team invaded the room. Dr. Matthews checked vital signs, reflexes, ordered urgent tests. The room turned into a frenzy of machines being adjusted and voices discussing possibilities. But none of that mattered to Emily. All that mattered was that Ethan Coleman was waking up. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Scans showed a significant increase in Ethan's brain activity, something the doctors hadn't expected. He's responding remarkably well, but it's too early to tell if he'll actually wake up. Dr. Matthews' tone was cautious, but Emily had no doubts. He was fighting to get back. She knew it. And then, the next night, everything changed forever. As she went about her usual routine, carefully wiping her face with a damp cloth, she felt something that made her freeze in place. His fingers closed around her wrist. It wasn't a spasm. It wasn't an involuntary reflex. It was intentional. And before she could react, a barely audible sound escaped Ethan's lips, a murmur, faint, hoarse, but real. Her eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly as it held his. "Ethan?" Her voice came out almost a whisper, fearful. Then it happened. Slowly, as if each movement were a monumental effort, his eyelids fluttered, and then they opened. Two blue eyes, intense but confused, met hers. The shock was so great that Emily froze. She had spent months staring at that lifeless face, those eyes that were always closed. Now they were there, blinking softly, focused on her. Ethan was awake. How? The word was out of her mouth before she could even process it. His jaw trembled slightly, his lips parted, but his voice came out only as an inaudible whisper. The reality of the moment hit Emily like a wave, the shock, the adrenaline, the fear, but most of all, the emotion. Her eyes filled with tears as her hand tightened on his. "It's okay. You're back." Her voice was shaky but full of certainty. Without wasting time, she pressed the emergency button. The room, which had been silent until then, was soon invaded by a team of doctors and nurses. But even amidst the hustle and bustle, amidst the tests and orders being given, Ethan's eyes remained fixed on her, as if, somehow, he knew that Emily Parker was the only person in the world who had never abandoned him. The next few days were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Ethan was awake, but still weak. His body wasn't responding as it had before, his voice was barely a whisper, and his mind seemed shrouded in a thick fog. He didn't remember the accident. In fact, he didn't remember much of anything. Dr. Matthews explained that this was common in patients who had been in a coma for so long. The memory may come back gradually, or it may not. We have to be patient. But for Ethan, it was frustrating. With each unanswered question, his expression darkened a little more. Emily stayed by his side whenever she could, and Ethan, even though he didn't fully understand who she was or why her presence soothed him, seemed to depend on her. One day, as he tried to lift a spoon to eat for the first time in months, his fingers shook so badly that the utensil fell onto his plate. He sighed wearily, his jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his frustration evident. Emily, who had been watching closely, picked up the spoon and gently placed it back in his hand. "It's not ridiculous. You haven't moved for a year. It's going to be hard, but you can do it." Ethan's eyes met hers. There was something there. A mix of vulnerability and determination. He swallowed hard and tried again. This time his hand shook, but he managed to bring the spoon to his mouth. Emily smiled. "See? One step at a time." He looked down at his food, saying nothing, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. Small, quiet, but real. And, in that moment, Emily knew that Ethan Coleman wasn't just a patient struggling to recover. He was a man learning to live again. But something still bothered her, the way he avoided talking about the past, as if he was afraid of what he might remember. That night, as Emily reviewed the accident report again, she noticed a detail that made her freeze. The autopsy report had mentioned that the car's brakes had failed, but there was no record of any mechanical defect. It was as if someone had done it on purpose. Her heart raced. Ethan hadn't just been in an accident. Someone had tried to kill him. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she reread the report. The information had been there all along, but no one seemed to have paid enough attention to it. The forensics team had concluded that the car's brakes had been compromised before the accident. This was no ordinary mechanical failure. It was intentional. She closed the file and looked into the room where Ethan slept. He still didn't remember anything, and maybe that was for the best, at least until she knew who was behind it. But one thing was for sure. Someone wanted him dead. The next morning, as she helped Ethan up for another physical therapy session, doubt gnawed at her. Should he know? What if this would only make him more confused and vulnerable? But then, when her eyes met his, Something inside her told her he needed to know the truth. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you." His expression darkened slightly. "About the accident." He blinked slowly, as if processing her words. "Do you know what happened?" Emily's hesitation lasted only a second. "Your brakes were sabotaged. Someone wanted you to not survive that night." The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan looked away, his fingers tightening on the handle of his walker. His breathing became ragged, and Emily felt a pang in her chest at the sight of him in this state. I don't know what to say." His voice was low, thick with disbelief. "Does that mean someone tried to kill me?" Emily nodded. "Yes, and I think you're the only one who can figure out who it was." He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. When he looked back at her, something in his face had changed. There was a different light in his eyes, not of fear, but of determination. "Then I need to remember." Over the next few days, Ethan worked harder to regain his strength. With each physical therapy session, each sleepless night trying to pull up memories from the past, he became more obsessed with understanding what had happened that night. Emily was always by his side, encouraging him, supporting him, but also worried about his growing frustration. And then one night, everything changed. Ethan woke up in the middle of the night panting, sweat dripping down his forehead. His gaze was lost, but his lips trembled as he formed the words. "I saw..." Emily, who was sleeping in a chair next to the bed, woke with a start. "What?" He swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "I saw a man on the road. He was standing there, just staring, before everything went black." Ethan's revelation sent a chill down Emily's spine. A man standing on the road, watching the accident. That meant not only had someone sabotaged the brakes, but that someone might have been there to make sure he didn't survive. "Can you remember anything else?" she asked, trying to remain calm. Ethan ran a hand over his face, clearly shaken. "It's all very confusing, but I remember the feeling. I knew something was wrong before I even lost control of the car." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "And someone was there. I know there was." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. He was starting to remember, and that was a good thing, but at the same time, it meant that someone still out there might want to stop him from remembering more. The next morning, while Ethan was in another rehab session, she decided to take action. She pulled out the accident report and cross-referenced it with the security camera footage from nearby. Her heart raced when she found a detail no one had noticed before. A black car parked near the bridge, parked there minutes before the accident. A car that had never been recorded in the official report. She relayed the information to Ethan, who was silent for a long moment, studying the grainy security camera footage. "I know that car." His voice came out barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes widened. "Whose is it?" Ethan rubbed his temples, as if trying to pull the answer from somewhere in his fragmented mind. Then something clicked. He looked at Emily, and his expression changed from confusion to somber. "My brother." Shock coursed through Emily. "Your brother. You think he..." Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw clenching. "Nathan's always been jealous of me. He's always wanted control of the company. What if he decided to push me out of the way?" The words came out thickly, as if he was still trying to come to terms with what he was saying. But deep down, Emily knew he already had the answer. Now all that was left was to prove it. The realization that Nathan might be behind the accident caused something inside Ethan to snap. He'd known his half-brother harbored resentment all his life. The rivalry between them had been evident since they were little. Nathan had always felt like he was in Nathan's shadow, like he was second best in everything. But it never occurred to him that jealousy could turn into something so cruel. If he really did it, If he tried to kill me, I need to know the truth." Ethan's tone was grave, and Emily saw a determination there that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just fighting to get his memory back, he was seeking justice. That afternoon, Ethan and Emily decided to investigate further. With the help of a contact at the hospital, they were able to access Coleman Industries' financial records from the months he had been in a coma. What they found was even more alarming than they had imagined. Strange movements, transfers of money to unidentified accounts, decisions being made without his knowledge. Nathan was taking over the company, while everyone still thought Ethan would never wake up. "He was already replacing me," Ethan muttered, holding the bridge of his nose, trying to contain his anger. But the biggest revelation came when they found a suspicious transaction. A large payment, made just days before the accident, to a man named Oscar Reyes, a known criminal involved in fixing traffic accidents. It was the proof they needed. Nathan didn't just want to get Ethan out of the way, he paid to make it happen. Emily felt a shiver run through her body as she realized the gravity of the situation. This is more than envy. He wanted to end you once and for all. The discovery brought a sense of urgency. Ethan couldn't just confront his brother without a plan. If Nathan was capable of something so cold and calculated, he might as well try to get rid of him again. "We have to be smart. If we go straight to him, it could go wrong." Emily reasoned and Ethan agreed. But one thing was certain, Nathan Coleman wouldn't get away with it this time. That night, Ethan and Emily came up with a plan. They couldn't just accuse Nathan without any concrete evidence that could bring him to justice. So they decided to lure their brother into a trap. Ethan would pretend he still didn't remember anything and would call him to the hospital to talk to him, pretending to want to discuss the company. In the meantime, Emily would be responsible for calling the police and making sure the evidence was handed over to the authorities at the right time. The risk was high, but it was the only way to unmask him. The next day, Ethan made the call. Nathan answered after a few rings, his voice carrying the same false warmth as always. "Brother, what a surprise. I thought you were still recovering." Ethan forced a hesitant tone. "I'm getting better. We need to talk about the company. Can we meet at the hospital?" There was a brief pause before he answered, "Sure, I'll be by in an hour." The plan was in motion. When Nathan arrived at the hospital, his posture was one of pure control. He walked into Ethan's room with a studied smile, but Emily, watching from the half-open door, saw the tension in his eyes. "So, brother, what did you want to discuss?" Ethan took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. "About what happened to me, about the accident." Nathan stood still for a second, but quickly regained his composure. "I'm glad you're trying to remember. It was a terrible tragedy." The falseness in his voice was almost palpable. That was when Ethan delivered the final blow. He grabbed the forensics report and threw it on the table. "If it was an accident, how do you explain it?" Nathan's face lost color for a brief moment, but he soon let out a forced laugh. "You think I had something to do with it? How absurd!" But his voice no longer had the same firmness as before. Emily, who had already called the police, knew it was only a matter of time. And as expected, before Nathan could leave, 2 police officers entered the room. "Nathan Coleman, you are under arrest on attempted murder charges." The shock on Nathan's face was instantaneous. He looked from Ethan to the police officers, then to Emily, and his expression turned to pure hatred. "This is absurd. Do you really think you can frame me like this?" His voice was a mix of despair and indignation, but Ethan remained calm, regarding his brother with a coldness he had never felt before. "You've already framed yourself, Nathan. All the evidence points to you. The police already have access to your bank accounts and the contacts you paid to sabotage my car." Nathan's mask of confidence finally began to crack. "That's a lie! I'm the one who kept the company running while you were lying in bed." He stepped forward, his eyes filled with fury. "It's always been you, hasn't it? The perfect heir, the son everyone admired. I'm tired of living in your shadow, Ethan." His tone was now filled with pure spite. But it didn't matter anymore. The officers approached, handcuffing his wrists. "Nathan Coleman, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in court." As Nathan was escorted out, Ethan let out a long sigh. Emily stood by his side, watching the scene in silence. When the bedroom door finally closed, he ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything that had just happened. For months, he had been trapped in a coma, while the person who was supposed to be his family plotted to destroy him. But now, he was free. Emily, noticing his condition, touched his hand gently. "It's over, Ethan. He can't hurt you anymore." He turned his face to her, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. Emily had been by his side throughout his recovery. She had supported him through every step, every struggle, every moment of uncertainty. If there was anyone he could truly trust, it was her. Ethan squeezed her hand lightly and smiled for the first time in a long time. "I never would have made it without you." Emily felt her heart race, but before she could respond, he pulled her into a tight hug. Right then, in that moment, Ethan knew that his second chance at life began now, and this time, he wouldn't be alone. The weeks that followed brought a sense of freedom Ethan had never felt before. Nathan was facing criminal charges, and with all the evidence against him, it was only a matter of time before he was convicted. The company, now officially back in Ethan's control, was undergoing restructuring, but to his surprise, that no longer felt like the most important thing in his life. Emily had shown him something he never knew he needed: a purpose beyond business, beyond money. For the first time, he didn't just want to rebuild his company, he wanted to rebuild himself. It was on a quiet night in the hospital garden that he finally put his feelings into words. Emily was by his side, watching the illuminated city, when he broke the silence. "You know, I spent so much time fighting to get back everything I lost. But the truth is, if I hadn't gone through this, I might never have met you like this. I would never have seen what really matters." Emily turned her face to him, her eyes shining in the dim light of the garden. "And what really matters?" Her voice came out almost as a whisper. Ethan didn't hesitate. "You." He took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "You helped me come back to life, Emily. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Her heart was pounding, and before she could answer, he continued, "I don't know what's going to happen from now on, but I know one thing. I don't want to face anything without you by my side." For a moment, Emily felt like the world had stopped. The entire journey, all the moments of pain, of doubt, of overcoming, it had all led them to this. Without saying anything, she smiled and squeezed his hand back. This time, there was no uncertainty, no fear of the future. Ethan Coleman had survived what should have been his end. He had been betrayed, abandoned, forgotten. But in the midst of it all, he found someone who would never give up on him. And because of that, he won. When Emily pulled him into a hug, they both knew this wasn't just the end of one story. It was the beginning of a new one. Quote of the day: "Life always gives a second chance to those who have the courage to start over." And this story isn't over yet. What does the future hold for Ethan and Emily? To make sure you don't miss anything, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like this video. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I'd love to know. And as for subscribing to the channel, It's very important so that we can continue delivering stories to you. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. Hugs, and see you in the next video.